this was where they split with Ozzy after this album.
It's also the when I look at the date from 1970 to 1976, they put out one album a year, at least. But there were 2 years between Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die. So
yeah, so they had a lot of other distractions in those days in the late 70s. So they fire Ozzy, and in one of music's most serendipitous happenings that has gone on, at the same time Ozzy is leaving Black Sabbath, Ronnie James Dio is leaving Rainbow. And, you know, this is one of those happy moments in music history for all of us who love heavy rock and heavy metal, because going from where they were with the last two albums, particularly in Black Sabbath, to finding Ronnie James Dio and him essentially righting the ship. You know, the ship has been like sailing off course and listing away and sinking slowly under, you know, this massive drug use and losing their direction and their path, and, you know, not being able to figure out where to go anymore. They managed to hook up with Ronnie James Dio, and they come, you know, they invite him down for a jam. His music, obviously, his work with Rainbow was well known to everybody at that time, and how good a singer he was well known to everybody at that time. And he goes down and he jams with the members of Sabbath. And I think the first thing they write is Children of the Sea. And it comes together like the first day they get together. Because I guess Tony had the part, but Ronnie comes in and starts singing. And had, you know, he came up with, Ronnie was never a big drug user. Ronnie was always on his game. Ronnie didn't, you know, have problems with his voice or his attitude in that respect. He was always a consummate pro. He came in, and all of a sudden, this is what's coming out. This kind of music is coming out, and while it's a little different, and we talked about, you know, the idea that how Dio sings not on the riffs where Ozzy would sing on the riffs, it is a subtle change in the sound of Black Sabbath, but my God, I mean, you know, this is like exactly what they needed. And even though Bill Ward doesn't remember recording much of this album these days because he was so far out of it, this album, Heaven and Hell, the first album of Black Sabbath with Ronnie James Dio on vocals, is one of the best metal albums of all time, and is generally in the conversation of the best metal albums of all time. There is not a dud track on this album. And if you think about, you know, we've been talking about the other albums with Ozzy and how like they were getting spottier and spottier from volume 4 on, right? There's only 8 songs, but every song on this album is absolutely fucking bulletproof and immensely good. And Ronnie came in and breathed new life into this band and inspired them musically. And the results are just spectacular. it's a different Sabbath, and people have always argued about which Sabbath they like better. I love them both for different reasons. To be honest, I was in my early years more exposed to the Dio Sabbath and got into the Ozzy Sabbath later because I was coming into the right age at this time. And most of the classic Sabbath albums, I was a little too young at that time. I certainly grew to appreciate them later, but this was much more current for me. This was happening at a time when I was, getting into my mid to late teens. And, this album, sparked another era for the band of, really coming back very powerfully and very, very strong. And, it turns out the split was great for both Ozzy and for Black Sabbath. Ozzy goes on after floundering for a few months. Sharon Osbourne rescues him from his own, nasty habits, gets him cleaned up, and gets him a solo career deal. And he finds Randy Rhoads. And, you have both of these. You have Heaven and Hell and Blizzard of Oz coming out in the same year. Right? Yeah. And it's like, what do we got here? We got an album from the remaining members of Sabbath and an album from Ozzy, both of which are better albums than anything Sabbath had come up with in the prior 5 years. Right? Blizzard of Oz is tremendous. Heaven and Hell is tremendous. But together, this band had run out of things to do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You have a situation where the split, as painful as it was at the time, turned out for the best for both sides. And, aside from the title track, which is an absolute classic on this album, everything on this album, like I said, there's not a bad track on this album. Everything on this album is absolutely stellar. If you want to know what heavy metal is about and what it should be about, what it should sound like, and what it sounds like at its best, put on Heaven and Hell. It's like I said, it's in the conversation of the best metal albums of all time. This is just as good as it gets. And, we have some clips of Ronnie Dio with Sabbath, and, we'll play some of it. But it's just a tremendous rebound. It's kind of like, you have a couple of instances in rock history where, Bon Scott with AC/DC, he dies, and they get Brian Johnson, and they come back with Back in Black, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't happen all the time.
No. No, it's usually over when the lead singer...
It's usually over when you lose your lead singer like that.
Especially when he's amazing,
Right. And, whether you want, whichever camp you're in on the Van Halen thing, you've got to admit that when the change took place at the singer level, the band basically reached new levels. Whether you liked it or you didn't, with Sammy Hagar on the vocals, it was clearly a commercial success for the band when they changed singers.
And a different sound, too.
And a different sound, yes. And it always comes with a different sound. Almost always. But you have now Ronnie James Dio with his powerful voice. It's not like Ozzy's voice. It's this mighty sound.
I don't know anyone who sings like that.
Yeah, I mean, and Ronnie came in with this completely different vocal aesthetic and this mighty sound, and it took Tony's riffs and songs to a different place that they could not have gone with Ozzy. And there's a lot to like for both eras, but this was the start of something, a new direction. And
well, let's we start off with Neon Night.
Mm-hmm. This is an up-tempo rocker, very straightforward, nothing particularly complicated here, and it's just a good opening track with a high energy sort of tempo. Mm-hmm. When you get to Lady Evil, it's like you have this galloping bass line that starts the thing off, and it's this geezer thing, and it's it's got sort of a great funky push-pull to it, sort of a mid-tempo track.
We also got Children of the Sea between those two.
Children of the Sea is, I'm looking at it in a different way. So Children of the Sea is, like I said, the first song they wrote together. This is sort of like almost a pop construct, but this is where you have that sort of thing where they do the gentle opening and then the riff comes in and just flattens you.
Yeah.
And you get to hear Ronnie's voice where he's like, we talk about the great Ronnie James Dio albums of all time, and people talk about Stargazer on Rainbow Rising. Generally speaking, Ronnie James Dio's most popular albums that he's ever been associated with were Rainbow Rising and Heaven and Hell. And there's a couple of them that I would say are their equals, but I mean, he just took this stuff to a different level with his voice. And he for all of Ozzy's greatness and his own character, from a musical only perspective, Ronnie just has a much more flexible voice and a much more dynamic voice and a much more powerful voice as an instrument. Just if you're classifying it as like, this instrument can do this, right? The human voice is an instrument, right? And you have guys who can sing like Jeff Tate and Ian Gillan who have like 5-octave ranges and stuff like that. And Ronnie has this character of his voice that he can change on a dime. He can sing. He started off as a doo-wop singer in the 50s. He can sing anything, really. He could sing the phone book, it would sound good. But he became known as this powerhouse metal vocalist, probably the most prototypical metal vocalist of because his voice, its natural quality had so much power and control and character that he is still on the Rushmore of metal vocalists of all time. I mean, and as good as, if not better than anyone else would be on that Rushmore with him. And
there's just weight behind it too. It's if you it's what I would think about like a perfect metal voice, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really apt sort of description. As much as I love the Bruce Dickinsons and the Rob Halfords, who have their own same level of stature, but Ronnie's right there with them, and Ronnie, in some ways, is so emblematic of metal. He's just, he's the guy who invented, the devil horns with your hands. He's the guy who popularized that in metal. He has this great storytelling voice, whether he's talking about Stargazer or something like that, or Heaven and Hell, where they'd stretch out Heaven and Hell live. They'd play Heaven and Hell live, and it was a Ronnie James Dio moment on stage, whether he was doing it with Sabbath or when he was doing it later with Dio. And he would go into this whole thing where he would just mesmerize the audience in a way that I would hesitate to say Ozzy does not do. Ozzy's sort of this lumbering guy on stage who's like, walking back and forth. He has his own character. He has his own charisma, but he's not got that same captivating persona.
He won't leave you in awe when you...
No, he'll leave you laughing.
Right.
And Ronnie James Dio won't ever leave you laughing. There's footage of Ozzy Osbourne with Sabbath in that reunion tour where he comes on stage in front of Tony Iommi and he's making faces at him and trying to get him to laugh, and he pours a bucket of water over his own head and stuff, and Tony's trying to play and he's cracking up. That's not Dio. Dio remained in character on stage. Dio was not a clown, right, in the way that Ozzy could be a clown. And just a completely different thing that he brought to the table. And I love both guys, I really do, but I mean, Dio is is a guy I miss so much since his death. I just miss him terribly, and everything he brought to this genre of music.
Yeah, I was seriously bummed when that news came out.
Yeah.
All right,
So anyway, like I said, there's no bad tracks on this album. Die Young is another epic moment.
Wishing
Lonely is the Word. He's singing his ass off on Lonely is the Word. Wishing Well is another up tempo one that's really fun. Every part of this thing is bulletproof. It's 8 bulletproof songs, and you really can't knock it.